CLS Talks.
Talk to me.
CLS Talks.
Talk to me.
CLS Talks.
Talk to me.
CLS
Talk to
Talks.
me.
Real information.
Talk to me.
Real education.
Talk to me. Talk to me. They don't talk to me. They look like they want it. They don't talk to me. They back. They want it. They don't talk to me. They back. They want it. They don't talk to me. They back. They want it. They don't talk to me. They back.
Welcome back to the CLS Talks. I'm Lionel Coveney. Des Carty is with me. Des, how you doing?
I'm grand, thanks very much, Lionel. Yourself?
Very good. Looking forward to filling in the census, which is upcoming, as I'm sure you are yourself. How are you approaching that?
I'm upcoming. Very good, I love it. I must say I gave it very, very strong consideration for all of 2 seconds. And
I didn't think you'd give it quite so long.
well, look, I think it's an appropriate thing for us to look at. I know we're cutting in on some of the other stuff we're doing, but because of the time that's in it, it's coming up to the end of April, here thereabouts. And as we've inferred with the article that we've put out, which we'll also hopefully link into the CLS Talks, I'd imagine. We put it down in the little section below and people can look at the article as well. So it's coming up on the 24th of April, which I understand it is actually the proper anniversary date of the 1916 Rising.
Not that you'd know, considering the celebrations are almost out of the way.
Yeah, so just to clarify that, they apparently, no, obviously I wasn't there, I don't have first-hand knowledge of it. I've been told that the 1916 Rising was on the 24th of April. So we're coming into that time, and it's ironic, really, and we've inferred this and showed this in the article, that the census has to be filled in on the 24th of April. So we sort of wondered, and I think we've put this in the front of the article, we wondered if the murdered rebels, as we called them, alluded to, would they have filled in the census form if they were handed a census form, or would they have perceived it to be another form of attack, excuse the pun, the form of attack on their freedom and independence and so on and so forth. I don't think, in my opinion, any of them would have filled in a census form.
I don't think so, and we're lauding these lads and ladies for the last, in an official capacity, for the last number of months, and will continue to do so, no doubt, as long as there's PR value to be got on the state side. But it's interesting that while we laud them and we buy into the narrative, would we take their lead? Would we follow them? Are we going to fill in that census? Why wouldn't we, I suppose, is the first question, because isn't it important that we know how many people live in the country, and isn't it important that the state is able to plan for us and to make policy and to decide what's best for us? Surely the census is harmless to us. What's the downside of filling in a census, and why wouldn't we?
Well, they've actually stated it here as to why we should on the actual form itself on the front page. Well, first of all, apart from the fact they've laid out the law and they've told you what could happen if you don't fill it in, they've also said that you should fill it in because this is their words. The census results will give a comprehensive picture of the social and living conditions of our people and will assist in planning for the future. So why wouldn't you fill it in and help plan for the future? Now, that is the only reference, I have to say, of the term people that they have in the document. So I'll read it again. It says, the census results will give a comprehensive picture of the social and living conditions of our people. Now, thereafter, and we'll get into this obviously as we discuss the census form itself, they do not use the term people, man, woman, or home for that matter in the rest of the documentation.
Our people. So are they laying claim to the people, to the men and women? Are they claiming ownership? And if by filling in that sense, are you agreeing to that?
Yeah. Possibly.
I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. It's just as you read it out, I thought of it. But anyway,
sure, whatever you think, just vomit it out there. We'll have a go at it.
But it's. I mean, say you decided you didn't want to fill in the census. Fairly stiff penalty there, according to it. Like, I don't know where this figure came from, but €44,440 potentially for not filling in a form. What's that all about?
Look, I can't honestly say how they come to the figure. But again, it's one of those things that they're telling you I think the terms are, I'll just find the exact terms, if it's not returned, obviously, and if you fail or refuse to actually fill it in. So if the enumerator, as they've called it, we might as well get into the body of this now.
Yeah.
And talk about the process by which they will get the information, send out the information, collect the information, and then obviously codify the information into a set of statistics for the state. So from my knowledge and what I've been told, most of the census enumerators, and these are the people that actually bring the forms to your door, they'll bring the forms to your door and they'll want to know who lives there at the outset when they hand over the document.
Yeah.
Now, for some strange reason, the census form that we have in front of us here, this was not handed to the woman of the house. It was put in through the letterbox. So I would imagine that the census enumerator probably knows the woman of the house and decided, well, it's probably just best I'll leave it in there. I know who the woman of the house is, and I can put that down that I've actually seen them or not. So I'd imagine that's the reason why it was just put through the letterbox. But in most cases, the census enumerators, for whatever reason, be it policy or protocol or procedure, they will knock on the door and try to get it to be handed to somebody, and will get their names.
It's almost like a service.
Yeah, a personal service.
Yeah, personal
one-to-one.
Service. Let's serve you with the census.
Yeah, well, that's what it seems to be, doesn't it? I mean, I don't know if you've had any experience yourself. I know that a few years ago when they did the first census, the census collector, enumerator came around and they expected it to be handed to them. And our argument was, well, it's already been sent back.
Well, I remember the last time the census came around as well, maybe I didn't have the misfortune, but somebody had the misfortune that the door was opened and there was a very nice lady on the other side and she was looking to verbally confirm the house number. So I said, well, I can't actually confirm that. And she said, well, why can't you? And I said, well, for the very same reason that you can't, because there isn't a number on the house. Oh, but there must be, because there's a number on either side, she said. I said, well, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is on this house. I can't confirm or deny that the number that you think this house is the number in question. She went away and never came back. That was it.
Very strange.
Yeah, very.
Okay. Well, if there isn't a number on the house, what are you going to do? Make it up?
Well,
that's what she wanted you to do, obviously.
Yeah.
Now, in dealing with that, I mean, we've had quite a bit of feedback in relation to how do you deal with the enumerator, first of all, when they call, and secondly, perhaps when they call back again to pick up the census form. So it's really down to yourself how comfortable you are with dealing with an enumerator. Now, in the first instance, if you're not there when they call to hand you the census, you're not there. So I wouldn't be sitting around all day waiting for an enumerator to call, because they could call any time between maybe a couple of weeks ago and maybe in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So I wouldn't be sitting around waiting. And equally, if a stranger does come to your door, I would say you'd be better off being careful answering the door to anybody, for that matter. You know, you don't know who's going to be calling to the door. So if you decide you don't want to answer the door, open the door, that's really your choice. They can't force you to open the door and talk to them. That isn't possible in law to do that.
Of course not. If you don't want to open the door, don't open the door.
Exactly. It's not any more complex than that. Now, again, if you do by mistake, we'll call it, or happen chance you open the door and they're there, I wouldn't get into a big long diatribe. Like as Lionel suggested there, if they ask you a question, you're better off saying, well, I don't know. You know, you can do what you want, but I just don't know. And equally, you don't have to answer any of the questions. Say, well, I don't know. Just that would be my reaction personally. I'd say, well, I don't know. I couldn't help you with that.
Exactly. And there may be people listening thinking, well, it's not that big a deal. Why would you not want to fill in the census form? And what's the story with you trying to avoid or dodge? And I think now is a good time to actually look at what's in the census form, and then maybe we can speculate on why the bits and pieces that are in there may be in there. And that'll give people, I think, a much clearer picture on where we're coming from when we say that, well, there is the possibility open to you that you don't have to do this if you don't want to. So here are some reasons why you may not want to, and they ultimately decide yourself.
I think in terms of keeping people listening and interested in the material, there's obviously a lot of detail we can go into. Now we'll try and summarise it obviously as much as possible, and we'll probably have a bit of a laugh as well doing that, I'd imagine. So just in closing out on dealing with the enumerator, look, if you want to take the form, take the form. You know, if nothing else, you might want to examine the form to see what it's all about, and there won't be any harm done. Now equally, when the enumerator calls back, if you have sent the document back through the post. Now, when we use the word send or return, we use that in the loosest possible sense. Now, you'll have to read between the lines on that, because obviously we don't want to tell people to not return the form, do we?
Of course not.
Yeah, so we would never tell anybody to not return the form. Obviously, then when the enumerator calls, if you have returned, inverted commas, the form, you won't have to say to the enumerator, we have not returned the form. You'll be able to say to the enumerator, yes, as far as I'm aware, the householder has returned the form.
And provision is made on the form, on the very first page, that you may do so.
Correct, absolutely, because they give you the address. So if you did return the form, as far, inverted commas, as far as the enumerator is concerned, they may not push it beyond that. Now, if they do, again, you by default can say, well, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, what are they going to do? What can they do? I don't know. Okay, see you later.
Good luck, that's it.
Yeah.
You don't have to give them any further information. If you are telling them, as far as I know, or as far as I'm concerned, the householder has returned the form. I don't know anything beyond that. That's it. They may say, who's the householder? You say, I don't know. It's not complex. And again, we've had loads and loads of people saying, well, how do we deal with these people if they come to the door? Be polite.
Oh yeah, there's no need for aggression, and we've discussed this in several episodes of the CLS. You don't have to go around fighting everybody. You can have your own battles through paperwork or whatever it might be, through the law, but you don't have to be nasty to people. You don't have to be mean to people. If you're nice and you smile at people, people are generally nice and will smile back at you, and you actually might have quite a nice discussion with the person on the doorstep, and you might be glad that they called. So, I mean, there is no need to actually be a bit of a dickhead about it.
Absolutely, yeah, I'd agree with that. I like the term. Don't be a dickhead. Okay, well, will we get into a bit more detail in terms of the questions?
Yeah, let's have a look at the lovely green form.
Okay, just to start with, the form is quite an extensive and elaborately detailed form. On the back page, it spells out explanatory notes, how to look at the questions, how to address them. But it's a total document, and the page amount in it is 24. Now, I think that's a massive. I mean, I've looked at the census from 1901 and I think it was 1911. And the census back then was one sheet of paper.
A head count.
A head count. That's all it was. But that's really all a census should be. There is not a need or a want, unless you have some sort of an agenda, for all this information to be gathered. And strictly speaking, the way we look at this today is, even if you did decide to start considering filling in this form, I don't think you can. I don't think it's possible once we've explained some principles of this. Because
that sounds a bit incredible to me, but we will get into the depth of what you've just said there, and Absolutely. It will begin to make sense.
Okay, let's have a start. Well, the first question, just to make sure we're on the same hymn sheet here, or same piece of paper. The first question that they have here is, what type of accommodation does your household occupy? Okay, and what did we say about that initially? Right, what type of accommodation does your household occupy? Right, I'll read verbatim a little bit from the article, then we can work in on it. The state/puppet government and their cohorts in crime, I know this is a bit strong, but bear with us, folks, will argue that because the housing stock shortfall and the need to assess this issue to find workable solutions, blah, blah, blah. So this is the arguments that the state will have in reference to finding out this information in relation to how many houses are out there, how many households, so on and so forth. They need to know if you occupy a house, bungalow, flat, apartment, bedsit, mobile or temporary structure. What a load of rubbish. There is not a lack or want of housing on this island, as we all know.
We certainly know that. Look around, no matter where you live, look around you.
In every town, village, county, whatever it might be, townland, there is thousands upon thousands of units of properties, whatever you want to call it. NAMA have a pool of properties, so on and so forth. So why, if there is such a massive housing stock, they have put out, well, there's a housing shortfall, there's a lack of housing. It's because the housing that is there, most of it is involved in mortgages and banks, and the banks have it. The banks have hold of it, and so is NAMA, and some town councils are responsible for some. They have a massive housing stock all over the island. Now, why then are they not housing people? Can you answer that, Lionel?
I can't. To me, as a normal human being, I would assume that you would want to put people in houses. Why should there be people living on the streets if they don't want to live on the streets when there are loads of empty houses around?
They could establish exactly how many houses were occupied or vacant or derelict or whatever it was simply by going to councils.
Of course they could.
It's not that...
They are accounted for. It's not that there's this vast swathe of houses that they don't know exist unoccupied.
Look at it's not even a guess now, because we know, like, there is certain taxes and charges in. I mean, you've got the household stroke property tax in. They want to basically make a further assessment as to what more taxes they can bring in and levy upon people. It's not a matter of, well, look at, we want to know how much housing is in the country because there is a lack of housing. It's because they want to know how many people, what they're living in, what conditions they're living in, what accommodation they have, and then the form itself spells out in an indirect way what sort of money is circulating throughout the country. So they now can make a fairly accurate stab on how much more they can tax people and charge people in relation to housing tax and property tax and so on and so forth. So this is to establish for perhaps the next budget or the next set of budgets over the next 5 to 10 years. And also, it's probably a condition of the EU or the IMF that they establish how much more people can be taxed without revolting.
You see, suddenly you've given a motive there. And that frame of reference, or that perspective, if you look at it from that perspective, which is the perspective of the state, why would they do what they're doing? Why are they asking these questions? It's like the movie They Live. I don't know if anybody's seen the John Carpenter movie with Rowdy Roddy Piper as a star. It's one of my favourite movies. It's a fine allegorical tale. Essentially what happens, this guy finds a pair of sunglasses, and whenever he puts on those sunglasses, he can see the world as it really is. He sees the world from a new perspective, and things suddenly make sense and they click for him. I'd highly recommend that to anybody. But it's like when you take that frame of reference or that perspective, you see things in a whole new light with regard to the questions that we're about to examine on this forum. So I think what you've said is quite pertinent and will help me and the other listeners as we go through the forum to understand what it is exactly that the state is looking to do and looking to find out, and why they're doing it.
Yeah, the questions that follow on from that. Now, we don't, although we can on this programme obviously get into the minutiae of the more personal questions, but the broader questions, they're not that broad in terms of the household itself and what comes in and what goes out.
Yeah.
So they are clearly, in my view, trying to establish, you know, what people own, what they have as wealth, what businesses they run, what assets they may have, what resources they may have. It's clearly borne out in the questions they have asked. And there is no other purpose. I mean, I wouldn't want to know what your business is unless I wanted to get something from you.
Of course.
Yeah, there's no other reason for me to know such things.
It's not a social call.
No,
we're not coming
not.
in for a cup of tea saying, how are you doing?
No, absolutely not. Okay, the next question, and I'll read the question out as per the actual census form itself. It says, this is question H2, when was your house, flat or apartment first built? Okay, what we said here in terms of the summarising the answers to this, we said this information, if submitted, will facilitate the assessment of your home's value. Now, in terms of that, they've listed out, was your house built between year X and year Y, and a whole sliding scale of times. So, and thus facilitate the calculation of the property tax stroke household charge and any other concocted tax or charge the state may wish to levy or bring in the future. Now, I wanted to say something, we didn't put this into the article, we might actually re-lodge the article and put an update on it. But the reason I put in, well, the reason the term home value was put in there, because I've explained this to some business people, and most business people are not aware of this, how to put a value on something. Now, I've sat in front of loads and loads of business people, and they just do not know how to put a value on something. And the principle of any value is always based upon the revenue it turns over.
Okay. Can you explain that a bit further?
Okay. So, say, for example, you're living in a home. We call it a home as opposed to what they've called it as a household. So you're living in your home, and unfortunately there is a mortgage on it, and you're paying, we'll say, round figure, €1,000 per month. Okay. So that €1,000 per month multiplies up onto 12,000 per year per annum. So 1,000 times 12 months.
Yeah.
So then the value of the revenue or the income stream from that is going to be 12,000 per annum. Now, if you have a mortgage for 20 years, that equates to you handing over to a bank or to a financial institution 20 times 12,000 euros. So you're looking at 240,000 euros. That is what the bank call a capita value.
Okay.
That is the value of the property to the bank. Does that make sense?
It does. So they're not looking at it from the perspective of what somebody is willing to pay, which is what we normally assume a value is based on. It's the value to them specifically.
Correct.
Okay.
Based upon the generation of revenue. Now, if there's a mortgage on it, it's a semi-guarantee, because there's a contract there that the owners have agreed to give the bank in the region of at least 240,000 for that 20 years. So that now has a value, a scientifically calculated value. It's not based upon the hearsay of whether or not somebody will pay something or won't pay something.
So without getting too much in depth into how that can manifest then in terms of the bank being able to make more money, presumably then that contract is worth something to them.
Absolutely.
That's something you could trade, or you could sell on, or you could do something with.
Correct. We sort of briefly were discussing something different this morning, or something similar this morning, to say. And now that contract then is worth, on the face value, 240,000. Okay. Now that isn't necessarily including any other additional cost, blah, blah, blah. So that to the bank is worth 240,000 in terms of turnover. So then, if they were dealing with another financial institution, they could package that into into a set of mortgages. It's called securitization, and then sell it on into the market, because there'll be revenue generated every month, every year for those contracts. So they are worth something.
So there's securitization in a nutshell.
Correct. Now, this lends itself to the next question that is on the census form, question H3. Does your household own or rent your accommodation? So this is where the figures start to come in, and they actually do want to know what the figures are. So I think, let's just check that. I don't want to say something that is incorrect. So question H4, if your accommodation is rented, how much rent does your household pay? So it's a leading question again. So going back to question H3, does your household own or rent your accommodation? So then this is where they begin to have you. Okay, it's leading into the next question as to how much rent is being paid, or mortgage. So from that, they can calculate the value of that property. Okay, now this also then lends us way. There's a whole myriad of stuff then that can be gleaned from having these figures and those numbers. Now, rightly, they say there in the document they won't be sharing your data, your personal data, with any other party. Now, that doesn't matter if they do or don't. It really is an irrelevancy, because they want to make an assessment for themselves based upon the broad statistical information and based upon what they will now budget for and what budget they will submit to the EU for sign-off. Because the EU will come back and say, no, you could base your calculations on budgetary fiscal policy and getting more money, because the EU will be advising the state on how much more money they can be taxing people on.
Advising stroke telling them what to do.
Yeah, that's probably a better word. So again, you can see how the questions lead into each other. First of all, they want to know for the establishment of a value when the house, flat, apartment was built, created, whatever it might be. Then they want to know if you're renting the accommodation, if you own it, or if you have a mortgage. And then they go into the third part of it. Now, they're all much of the same question. They're leading into one another. Then they want to know how much money is involved, how much revenue can be generated from this property. Now, again, this is something you have to get into your heads. And I don't know if I said it often enough. I certainly have said it often enough to certain individuals. But again, it's worth putting into your head how a value is actually calculated. Again, it's calculated based upon the amount of revenue something turns over in a month, multiplied by the year, multiplied by the contract, which could be 20 years, could be 30 years, 40 years. So that then establishes the capita, what the banks actually call a capita or capital value of something. Very simple calculation, and it's something that the politicians don't talk about. It's something that the banks actually don't iterate very clearly. They don't want people to know this. They don't want to know where they get their figures from. They want people to think, right, well, the value of something is, as you've suggested before yourself, Lionel, the value of something is what somebody is prepared to pay for it. No, not for the sake of fiscal policy, not for the sake of monetization, not for the sake of securitization of these contracts and selling them on to make more money. It's based upon real figures, what the contract says it can generate. It's not an anomalous thing, it's a very specific thing. Does that make sense?
Absolute sense. So they're the sunglasses, so we'll keep them on throughout this conversation to go back to the they live analogy.
Very good. Now, you can have a go. I think it's question H4. Now, unless you have anything else to say about H1, H2 and H3.
Not really. I think you've mentioned it in the article and you've used the term social stratification. You've codified it then, or broken it down and said discrimination, and that essentially is what we're talking about here. It's about categorising and breaking things into different strata so that then policy can be decided upon based on their figures that serve them best rather than what we generally understand figures to be, or terms of reference or definitions. So that's very, very important. It is all about perspective. Look at it from this perspective as opposed to what we would automatically assume on the surface level, and things begin to click into place and you're able to put that jigsaw together. Because we have a lot of seemingly unconnected jigsaw pieces here in the questions, and a lot of people have said to me over the last while, well, these questions are ridiculous. Where are they coming up with these questions? Why do they want to know this? That's what we're trying to get into the depth of here, so that you can then make an informed decision based on knowledge of why they are asking you these questions. Then you decide, well, do you want to answer them or not?
I'm loath to say that we're second guessing here. I don't think we are. I think that a critical analysis, as we've done on this. Now we've done more depth analysis. We could be here talking about this for the next 3, 4, 5 hours and still not get the full analysis covered. We're just giving a summarised version of what we have construed as being critical, looking at it from with the critical goggles on. So again, folks, obviously we'd like you to go away and look at the document in the context of which we're talking about it here, and decide for yourselves. It's not, we're not trying to dictate to hear people you should or should not, or do something you don't want to do. You should look at this critically and decide for yourself independently of anything we have said.
Absolutely. And we've already covered then, like, if the accommodation is rented, how much rent does your household pay? Again, talk about personal information. It doesn't really get any more personal than that. But it leads into question 5, which I think is extremely telling and very, very interesting. Yeah. How many rooms do you have for use only by your household? Now, in the article, there is discussion of the bedroom tax. Some people will be familiar with the bedroom tax in the UK, some people won't. It's essentially a tax based on the number of rooms that you can use in your home that you can sleep in. It's not necessarily that you have a 3-up semi-detached or something like that. They specifically in this census form tell us what doesn't constitute a bedroom. So to quote from it directly, do not count bathrooms, toilets, kitchenettes, utility rooms, consulting rooms, offices, shops, halls or landings, or rooms that can only be used for storage such as cupboards. But do count all other rooms such as kitchens, living rooms, bedrooms, conservatories you can sit in, and studies. So all rooms that you could possibly sleep in. I mean, they're defining a bedroom as a kitchen or a living room or a bedroom. So a bedroom can be a bedroom. So you have 2 different terms for bedroom there.
It's where you bed down, basically.
What could that be all about if not for potentially some form of a bedroom tax, which everybody in this country who is aware of it has said, that's ridiculous. How did they get away with that in the UK? How have people accepted that? Well, look at your census form. It's coming here, or some form of it is coming here. Why else would they ask the question?
Well, I think as well as this, there's a level of social conditioning in putting out these types of forms, because the more you mention something, the more acceptable it becomes. Yeah. You see, they're not presenting this census form in a critical sense. They're not saying, well, this is a census form, but what do you think of it? Should we do something slightly different? They're saying, well, let's mention in a roundabout way the potential of a bedroom tax. Let's mention in a roundabout way the potential of a new property tax or a new form of tax on property. Let's mention in a roundabout way other taxes. And that's what they're doing with the census form. So, like, again, we'll talk about this in the latter part of the talk, I suppose. This basically is a form of conditioning. The document itself is actually a declaration. They've called it a declaration, and when they say you should sign, if you sign this declaration, you have to agree that you're telling the truth, so on and so forth. So what they're working you towards is basically agreeing a contract with them. Now, in retrospect, and we've said this as well, and we'll talk about it more extensively as well, I'd imagine, they're bringing you into a place where on the face of it, it doesn't look, as we said, too innocuous. Okay. then they frame the questions in a sort of a gentle form or fashion. And then at the end, they get you to sign the declaration.
Yeah.
So when or if, or it's not an if really, it's when the next set of taxes are levied upon the people under whatever acts or codes or statutes. And I actually think they actually have already in place the acts that would allow them to bring in all of these. They actually exist at the moment. Now, off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you. I know we have read the stuff before. We can come back another time and explain that. But I think that the law is already there. They've already created the law. And now this is a nice soft approach to bringing these things in. But let's get on into the further potential charges, taxes, fees, and so on and so forth that they can bring in.
Now, Des, as we discuss that, I think it's worth bringing up at this point that you mentioned it. It's not just idle speculation. There is actually provision in the acts that are already in place for new taxes and charges based on what currently exists to be brought in. It's already there, and I mean, people who have registered for this, that and the other have already signed up to potential future charges, and there's very little that a lot of people will be able to do about that.
Yeah, on the face of it, that's right. The two specific acts which for some reason slipped my mind, but I actually think we've covered it in the article, both the Household Charge Act and the Property Tax Act.
Yeah.
So if people want to, look, it's a couple of tomes of reading, there's a massive amount of paperwork in it, but you will find embedded, hidden within those acts, the facility to bring in further charges and taxes in relation to things like a bedroom tax. Now, I'm not sure if it's spelled out as a bedroom tax, but it's facilities, services and other stuff like that. So they're worth a read. I mean, this is the sort of stuff I read at night time before I go to sleep. So again, it's something we covered in the past, but they have actually brought in, as you suggested, this legislation already. So it's unfortunate for those who've signed up. But again, looking at these things retrospectively as well, if you've signed up for something and you just didn't know what you signed up for, you could have an argument there that you were coerced into it, forced or misled into it.
Yeah, well, I'm wrong to say that there's nothing you can do potentially. There's always something you can do.
Absolutely, yeah. Everything is reversible. Okay.
There also, with regard to the water charge, and we will get onto it because the next question after the household question is, it's actually not the next question, but I will digress slightly. There's provision with regard to those who have signed up for the water charges for a whole raft of other measures which we already see in other European countries and in the US with regard to water and how people are charged for their use of water. And we'll get into that in a little while, but just it's worth bearing that in mind with specific reference to future charges that may be levied or most likely will be levied.
Will be levied, yeah.
So the next one is fuel. Question 6, H6. What is the main type of fuel used by the central heating in your accommodation? Why in God's name would a question like that be asked?
Well, it lends its way then forward to obviously the assessment and statistically the statistical data that they will glean for this. They'll know exactly how many people have used oil, used gas, used peat, used wood, whatever it might be, whatever fuel it is, or use Census forms to light their fire. Not that you would or should, but it's a potential way of starting the fire anyway, or starting a fire, should we say.
I'm reliably informed they burn well.
Yeah, so they say. So again, further charges and taxes can be levied, and then there's obviously the environmental taxes and charges for destruction of the environment, which we're so guilty of.
Okay, so potentially, just to speculate here,
carbon taxes and so on and so forth.
You're sitting there in some office and you're tasked with the job of dreaming up some new charge or whatever it might be, some new tax, bring in some more revenue. Okay, we've a figure and a target we need to make. We know from this census now that a certain percentage of the population burn oil, for argument's sake. Mm-hmm. So we know that if we up taxes on oil, we can make X amount of money now because we know how many people, or gas or whatever it might be. So this is where that information could potentially be useful, yeah?
Absolutely. I mean, whether or not people realise this or know this already, in terms of fuel for their homes or fuel for your car, whatever it might be, you know, there's a massive amount of revenue directly taken from the money you pay already in taxes, as in VAT, to the government anyway. So they're going to levy more and more. So now this is based upon loose information at the moment. Again, it's not research I've gone really into, but as far as I know, 2/3 of the amount of money you pay for, say, putting a fuel of petrol into your car is paid in VAT to the government. So literally, at the present time, you could be paying, if there was no VAT stroke tax charge on fuel, you could be paying a third of what you're paying. I mean, that's a phenomenal amount of money they're generating from fuel alone.
It really is. And I remember a couple of weeks back, people were almost throwing parties because at the pump diesel went down to about €1.
Yeah.
It's only a couple of years ago that people were up in arms because diesel went up to €1.
Yeah.
So imagine that you, with one stroke of a pen, removed 60% of that again.
Well, you're down to 33 cent for a litre of fuel. I mean,
wouldn't that help get the economy going again? Because you'd suddenly have viable businesses all of a sudden overnight. I mean, this is ridiculous.
That is actually a very, very good point to make. If people consider, the argument is, and we've actually had emails about this as well, it's silly, if you don't pay your taxes, who'll build the roads? Who'll provide the hospitals? Well, the way I look at this is, right, if you're going to pay only a third of what you're paying for the moment for the fuel, okay, every economy is based upon how much money people have in their pocket to spend into the economy.
Of course.
So what you have, let's just say you decide to buy a litre worth of fuel for €1, and I know it's a little bit more than that. So if tomorrow morning the VAT was taken away, or the tax was taken away off the fuel, you've now got another 60 odd cents to be spending into the economy. Most people will spend it. Most people do not hoard. They want nice things, they want new things, they want different things, they want different experiences. Most people will spend the money. They won't hoard the money. Now, there are people that will hoard the money, of course, but that comes off the back of fear of lack, fear of want of something, that you would hoard something. You're afraid that someday you might be stuck. The rainy day, they keep pumping this out, the rainy day. There wouldn't be a need for a rainy day if you had the cash flow, if you had the money in your pocket to spend it. It would create jobs, it would create an economy, it would create wealth for people on a broad basis. It would create cash flow. Cash flow is the lifeblood of an economy. Cash flow that's taxed kills an economy. That's basically it.
And then, of course, by default, you have that scarcity-based system of mind control.
Correct. Being pumped out day in, day out. So, to my mind, basically, and I know it sounds a bit harsh, but what you have is a set of, in my perception, a set of criminals running the country, per se. Because any business person, we call them, for lack of a better description, any man, woman that runs a business or is trying to generate some revenue for themselves, they're killed with taxes. And they see all this money coming in, and they see a half or a third or three-quarters of it go out back to a state that are providing absolutely nothing for them. A simple example would be rates. What the hell are people paying rates for? Now, again, it's a bit of a challenge to get into a place where you're not paying rates, obviously, because you'll have the council on you, they'll take it to court, so on and so forth. But rates is dead money. And it has killed thousands upon thousands upon thousands of businesses in every high street, in every town and city in this country. It's killed them. It's wiped them out. Rates alone. So that's because it takes away from their cash flow. They haven't got the money now to employ people. They haven't got the money to buy stock. They haven't got the money to pay their stock suppliers. Never mind anything else. So rates itself, the councils themselves are, now again, we're going slightly off on a tangent.
No, that's fine, I think. Yeah.
But it's still relevant to the wider sort of economic argument. They have this argument, well, you can't tax the rich because their money is necessary. They want the drip feed. It'll drip feed down to people. Well, no, that's rubbish. It's found now, I think we've quoted this as well, 70 to 80% of the wealth is retained by 20% of the people. Yeah. And the margin is getting wider and wider and wider.
And every time we see one of these so-called economic collapses, it's simply just a manufactured transfer of wealth, a further transfer of wealth from those who have little in the first place, but there are loads of them, to those who have the wealth, that 20% or that 1%, depending on where you're looking at around the world.
Let's call it what it is. It's a lie. It's a lie.
Yeah.
And it benefits the ultra wealthy. It doesn't even benefit the middle classes anymore. It benefits the wealthy and those that are going to become ultra wealthy, because that's what exactly has happened and is happening and will continue to happen until people take the blinkers off and look at these types of things in the way perceivably that we look at it, in a critical manner. We're not coming at this, I suppose, from we're trying to keep away the prejudice. But more and more, as you look at this, and the more critically you look at this, you can't help but realise, well, it's all a big lie. It's lies perpetrated by the media, by the politicians, by the government, by the state. It's all a big lie. And it's designed to take away the wealth of nations. I think that was a title of some economic guru back in the 1800s, but it was called The Wealth of Nations. So that's what exactly it is designed for. It's designed to keep people in their place and keep taking money from their slaves, and that's what they treat people as. So let's move on before we get too entrenched in.
Yeah, well, the next question was question H7, which was, what type of piped water supply does your accommodation have or not? And we already briefly mentioned this, that potentially there could be further charges down the line, but there's something very interesting in that question as well. They already presumably have their database of those who have signed up for the water charges and haven't paid. So why do they need to ask this question again? Well, there are certain people who are exempt from that charge. So if you have your own well, for example. Now, this would be a very good way of weeding out those people and bringing them into another form of contract by making this declaration and saying, well, okay, well, you've signed up now through the census. We know that you have this, and here's why we can suddenly charge you for something we couldn't do before, perceivably.
Absolutely. They're trying to ring fence everybody into their own little...
So drag everybody into the net.
Everybody has to be brought in. Now, something that we've put in the article as well, but we've stated here that water is the new gold or oil. Okay, it's the ultimate resource. You control the water of a country. Now, again, it's similar. If you control the money of a country, you'll control the country. But water is essential to life. You control the water, you can dictate exactly what happens in that country. You know, it's such a massive, massive resource. It's not something we're lacking in this country. Water is our wealth because we're a temperate climate. Anything can grow in this country. You can grow anything. I mean, there's nothing beyond growing in this country, be it outdoor or indoor. We have such a temperate climate. You put something in a polytunnel and it proliferates in this country. The soil is generally quite good, the ones that haven't been contaminated by sewage and all the rest of it, and we'll get onto that as well. Yeah. But basically, the wealth of this nation, the wealth of this country, is not in mineral resources. There is some mineral resources, obviously, but the wealth of this country is the fact that we're living in a temperate climate and we have a downpour of water every single day in some form. We don't get overexposed to massive temperature rises or decreases. We have a temperate climate. Anything can grow here. It's the garden of the world as far as I'm concerned. You go to any other country, they have some extremes in most countries, but in Ireland, for some reason, we have a nice temperate climate. Anything can grow.
The luck of the Irish, eh?
Look at the Irish. Well, we do grow, we can potentially grow everything, but if people take a look around, all you see is fields of grass. Yeah. Right? And all they're doing is mass producing cows for dairy and for beef, filled with antibiotics and chemicals. So, what the hell is going on? Why don't we grow and be self-sustaining? Now, I know you're one for self-sustenance, and I am as well. We're into that. But it doesn't take... You don't need a large plot of ground.
Oh, you don't need any kind of size. No matter... You could grow it on the balcony of an apartment, enough food to live.
Yeah.
Genuinely.
Yeah.
For several people. It's incredible what little space you need to actually be able to grow food.
In this temperate climate.
Yeah.
It's perfect climate.
And all kinds of food.
Oh, there we go. Now, is there anything else we need to say about that? What type of... Well, again, as you said, rightly said, Lionel, they're trying to put everybody in a little bracket. So they are going to find a way now of hitting people with private wells or on private schemes and people that literally drag water from the well. And again, there's a potential there, as is in some other European countries, where they potentially could be charging you for how much water falls on your roof.
And there is provision made for that. It was actually, would you believe, brought up in the Dáil by, I think, Richard Boyd Barrett or somebody like that. There is provision in the contract that you have with the state, if you've registered for the water charge, that they can do that if they so wish. You've already signed up for that. So that's not pie in the sky, idle speculation. That's already potentially on the way, should they decide to bring it in.
Again, the census is just for a number crunching exercise now. They'll bring this in a budget. Now, they won't necessarily bring all these things in at the same time. They'll ease them in, as they generally do. But they'll be under the guidance and direction and diktat of the EU. because they had to go to the EU now to get their budget signed off.
Yeah.
That's simply
what's really changed since 1916. The flag.
Well, that is the question again. Like, I mean, I don't perceive myself as being one of those people that would go out and create a revolution or anything like that, but you have to consider the guys, and we won't go back to this too often, but I think it's worth noting, the guys that were perceivably murdered, the 1916 rising leaders and some of the other parties that were murdered, that's what I'd say anyway, these weren't stupid people. These were well educated, knowledgeable, and people that would critically look at the stance and the situation and the position of the Crown in the country at the time. They would, if they looked at this piece of paper, they would see this as nothing more than the state now trying to force them into a contract. That's it. I don't know how you could look at it in any other way. And I don't think any of these people that participated critically and thoughtfully in what they did, because none of them really wanted to take up arms.
Of course not. Why would you?
And I would suggest also the reason they were specifically murdered and taken out is because they actually knew what was going on. You can't have too many of those people walking the streets. You can't have too many people that can actually think about what's critically going on. It causes massive problems for the state or for the Crown. So that's why they just blatantly said, no, look at whatever, if we let these guys live, this is not going to get any better.
Yeah. And
they took the decision at the time, be it good or bad, and said, no, we have to take these guys out. We have to get rid of them because they're causing too many problems. They know too much. And that's what happened. Now, the state are not very straightforward when it comes to this. They never discuss these things. I have never heard on the media, on the radio, on the television, in the papers, a critical view of what happened, why it happened, and why the Crown decided unilaterally to just murder these people, because there wasn't a need to do that. They were prisoners of war. They should have been kept. It was a war. That's what happened. Okay, so...
Yeah, well, we're about to get into some real shite now. The next question, question 8. What type of sewerage facility does your accommodation have? On the surface, these questions appear to be getting more and more ridiculous, but let's tie this one in again, because there was a big issue of septic tank charges a while back. I'm not totally au fait with that, but it's been gone into here in the article, and there's a bit of background given. So, septic tanks, just another way of charging people for, well, quite literally having a shite.
Well, there's other stuff as well contained within that, obviously. But again, this alludes to Irish Water and all the rest, and they were talking about whether or not Irish Water should be taking on board the disposal of sewage, and they haven't, as far as I'm aware. But in place of that, or as a precursor to that, they're dealing with the sewage issue. They have always made the argument that, the septic tanks out there that are potentially leaking into the water table and into the rivers and into the lakes. Now, how you would establish statistically if that is true, because I don't believe for one moment.
Well, what, do you dig them up?
Well, this is what we've suggested. If a council are going to make an argument with you, we believe that potentially your septic tank is leaking into the water table. Well, the only way to prove that in a court of law, we'll say, for example, is to dig the feckin' thing out and test it. You'd have to dig around. There's a lot of ground you'd have to dig out. You'd also have to test the overflow to see how that's working. And then if you have a ground system where it's supposed to seep into the ground, you'd have to test that as well. Now, as far as I'm aware, none of that testing was ever done on this island, but yet they've alluded to the potential that these septic tanks could be leaking into the water table. Now, I've seen septic tanks being built. Going back into the 60s, 70s, not in the 60s, but in the late 70s, actually seen a septic tank being built for the house we lived in at the time in the countryside. These were pretty well sealed units. They were very, very well sealed units, and they were designed so that the overflow then would take the residual water, and then the ground system they had then would, you literally came out with almost purified water at the end of the system. And these were natural systems. They did not need to be maintained. Now, I think on the opposite side of that is the reason they would raise this issue of the potential for septic tanks to be contaminating the ground and the water table and the rivers and the lakes is because it diverts away from the question about the farming.
Yeah, what really is damaging the water table?
Yeah, if the water table is being damaged, And I've no doubt some water tables in some areas have been damaged, and no doubt I think it's Roscommon still have a boil water notice in place.
Yeah.
So basically, it avoids, by raising this issue in terms of the individuals that have these septic tanks could be contaminating the ground. I don't know, maybe there is some contamination in the ground, but that has not ever been proven to be true. It takes away from the point being that farming and industry does directly contaminate the ground, does directly have sewage, raw sewage flowing into the water table, the rivers and the lakes. But that's not an issue they want to discuss.
No, and the timing of the septic tank and septic tank charge issue was interesting as well, because I remember it was just when fracking had begun to be mooted as a potential way of extracting energy from the ground. And anybody who does any bit of research on fracking, and it's a huge issue in the UK and all over the US, around the world, will see that the ecological, environmental damage that is done by fracking, and in particular to the water table, is absolutely monumental. Yeah. And I don't think it was a coincidence that suddenly the issues of a few septic tanks around the country was brought up and splattered, no pun intended, all around the media, just as fracking was being put as a viable option on the table in this country for the first time.
Absolutely. No, that's not, you can say it's a coincidence, but I think it wouldn't be a coincidence. There's a reason why they drive this type of attention to these types of things. And again, if people visit farms, I was brought up on farms, walking around farms, looking at farms, working on farms. The amount of sewage and stuff, contaminated material that flows from a silage pit. I don't know if you've ever seen a silage pit.
I have, yeah.
Yeah. Now, apart from the smell, it's obvious that there's something wrong with the smell. When you open up the silage pit, the smell goes for miles. Contaminates the area for miles. But the outflow of the material, now, sometimes it's contained, but on most farms they do not and cannot contain the outflow of waste material in terms of liquid that flows out of those silage pits. It's seeping out constantly because it's rotting material. Now, they add, I think it's molasses to the silage. There may be other additives nowadays, but as far as I'm aware, historically they used to add molasses, but that was to sweeten the taste of rotting grass for the cattle, so as the cattle would eat it. So what they're doing is they're feeding cattle rotting material. And obviously the cattle can digest it or ingest it, and whatever it might be, the cattle do. But the reason for adding the molasses, obviously there's probably a preservation issue as well. It helps preserve the material, but what they're doing is they're sweetening rotting material and feeding it to cattle, who in turn then are butchered for their meat and their milk product.
Yeah.
So that's what they're putting into the food supply. Material that's rotting fed into cattle, filled with antibiotics and kept alive. And it's probably because they're eating rotten material that they have to feed them so many antibiotics and so much in the way of antibiotics, and then obviously to boost the milk supply and all the rest of it. So look, it's infiltrated this issue into the food chain. So people that drink milk, now I'm not one, I don't drink milk anymore, don't take dairy products. I used to, and I feel a lot healthier because I'm not taking those dairy products. But that's what you're eating and drinking. Rotting material, essentially, that cattle have regurgitated or reconstituted. So they won't look at the farmers for obvious reasons. The farmers have perceivably too much power. And they're not going to start saying to farmers, well, you'll have to actually put in a system that, takes away this rotting material out of your farms, because it'll cost the farmers much more money than they'll be able to use to survive on. So it'll kill the farmers.
Plus, farmers are a group that, by my estimation, are quite a dependent group upon the state. And the state wants groups that are dependent upon them because they're much more easily controlled, and it's much easier to levy taxes and charges, etc., etc. And because of the amount of grants and this, that and the other that has been brought in mainly since 1973 and the advent of the EU, or our membership of it, there's very little they can do without the state approving it or telling them they can or cannot do it, and a lot of that comes down from Europe. So they are a group of people who they're very vocal, they have a very strong vocal voice. They could potentially bring down any government at the time. So you don't want to piss the farmers off in one sense if you want to hold on to power, and you're looking at that microcosmic aspect of the power structure. But in a broader sense then, you don't want to break up the structure there either, because you have a dependent group who are happy at the moment to be dependent. So keep them that way.
Yeah, it's a symbiotic relationship. I think that's the word. You know, they're feeding off each other. And, you know, I have every empathy for people who are farmers. I have every empathy for people who work in factories, so on and so forth. You know, they're just people. But I think farmers need to take a look at this as well. You know, most farmers, small farmers, and I live in a community of small farmers, they're not, they're not affluent.
Yeah.
You know, they're struggling. Small farmers, I'm talking about people with less than 50 acres of land, for example. Now, there was another point I think we should make in terms of the irony of what's going on. I mean, if you go down to the west of Ireland, some parts of Galway, and certainly I think it's Roscommon as well, you can't drink the drinking water.
Yeah.
You can't do it. And yet they have this thing called Irish water. And the point I wanted to make was, I'm pretty positive that an awful lot of those people who cannot drink their drinking water have still signed up for the water charges.
Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't that like...
Well, it's madness.
I don't get that. Like, you're saying, right, this is poison.
Yeah.
But I'll agree to pay for the poison. Like, it's, as we suggested in the article, it's like turkeys voting and contributing to a Christmas club.
Yeah.
They're not just voting for a Christmas club and agreeing to it, they're actually contributing to the knives and the butcher's blocks that are going to kill them.
Well, if you go into a supermarket and you pick up an apple and the apple is rotten and there are a few worms peeping out at you, are you going to go up to the till and hand over money for that rotten apple? Most people wouldn't do that.
But these people would.
But these people might, yeah, because they're doing it in another sense.
Well, it's the same principle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are you going to pay for something that's going to kill you? Well, it seems you are.
Yeah.
And you've already done so. And these people now, we would hope they'd consider what we are saying in terms of the census. But my guess would be an awful lot of these people will still fill in the census form and send it back.
Because there is that perceivable gun being held to the heads of people, and people are afraid. Fear, of course, is a controlling mechanism that's used by the state and by many different people to get what they want. But it's almost like a form of coercion. I mean, you look at the first page of that. Here's the bad stuff that's going to happen to you by way of a fine if you don't fill this in. Oh, shite, yeah, I don't want to fill that in. I don't want, but I better.
How much did they say it was again? Is it
44,440?
Wow. I'm not sure how the hell they got that.
Why didn't they just stick in another 4?
Or just round it up to 50?
Yeah.
Or round it up to 100?
No.
Okay, what's the next thing now we're looking at?
The next one is the issue of cars and vans. Question 9. How many cars or vans are owned or are available for use by one or more members of your household?
Okay. Well, look, I'll read verbatim what we have on the article and then we can elaborate perhaps on it. This is, as you said, question H9. This question helps the state identify how much revenue should be coming into their collection every year from registrations, licensing, taxing, VAT and testing ad infinitum, so on and so forth, compared to what is coming in at present. Now, they can decide what further measures to take to meet their quotas or targets, and we spoke about quotas and targets before in relation to the Garda Síochána. Sometimes it is just a matter of the state and our revenue issuing a diktat to An Garda Síochána to perform more roadblocks and stops to generate additional revenue required, and thus in turn also help generate even further revenue through fines, penalties, fees and court appearance. So you have a double whammy here. Now, I was told last night that there's a new penalty points system has come out for bald tyres apparently.
Wonderful.
So, like, it's already starting. Whatever they're going to do.
The next thing, it'll be bald heads.
Yeah. Well, I hope not. I'm fecked if that happens. Right, okay. So, they have a double whammy here. You see, they'll be able to establish, through this statistical information and data, you know, who has or hasn't got access to a car or van or whatever it might be. And then they can then calculate how much revenue should be coming in from people having access to these resources, i.e. cars and vans. So then they have to say, well, actually, how much money is coming in and how much money should be coming in. So they know now how much more they can get.
Yeah.
Alongside the additional revenue that's generated if they do issue a fine. Yeah, so there's a fine for the amount of money you owe or allegedly owe for whatever it is, tax or insurance or whatever it is associated with cars and vans. The fine, plus there's potential court appearances, which have to be paid for, and more than likely you'll pay for them as the alleged offender. And then, of course, that generates money for the court itself, the judge, the solicitors, if you employ a solicitor, the barrister, if there's a barrister required, and so on and so forth. So it's not just a double whammy, it's a potential triple whammy in terms of fines, fees, charges, costs, and the actual amount of money they allege you owe as well.
And there are people who may be listening and thinking, well, you're talking about money, it's not all about money. Well, it kind of is. When you're dealing with the state, the only real function of state is to generate income. And people can counter that and they'll say, well, yeah, but they do provide certain things and they build roads, etc., etc. However, if you're a highwayman and you want to hold up the stagecoaches that pass by your patch of turf, and you're having a real problem with the locals because they don't like this happening and they're revolting against you, and it's potentially going to put you out of business. What do? Give them something back. You know, build a nicer stretch of road for them there to justify the fact that you are holding up the stagecoaches as they pass over. Then you can suddenly justify it. And what this is a form of legitimised highway robbery. And that's why we're talking about money all the time. It's not just a census. The census is here for a reason. That's why we're having this discussion. And that's why we're talking about money all the time, because that's all the state essentially wants from you is your money.
Correct. It keeps you enslaved. If you're tied into that system, there's always something else coming along next and next and next, and you have to work out. It's serfdom. It's feudal tenureship, or whatever you want to call it. I think we've made reference to that as well laterally.
Now here's a great one. Question 10. Does your household have a personal computer, PC? Now, yeah, I mean, what if you've got a MacBook or something? But anyway, that's not really relevant. Why computers? Could this possibly be linked to the fact that very few people actually watch what they watch now on a television?
Yeah. They haven't mentioned the term television.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously loads of people do watch television still, but so many people are consuming their media now through computers.
Devices, handheld devices, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so again, it lends it into this, and it's something that, as we like to call him, Pit Rabbit. Pit Rabbit, brought up a few years ago now. And
who was Pit?
But he basically inferred at the time that he was driving a broadcasting license or receiver license, whatever you want to which way you want to put it. And now having it in the census, having that sort of question in the census will allude. It tells you, right, well, this is the next thing on the horizon for them, because as you suggest, very few people are watching the TV. A lot of people are cottoning on to the fact, and I think more specifically, it's happened in the UK. There's been an awful lot more reluctance for people to pay licenses because they're paying it to one broadcaster and nobody else is getting their share of it. And similarly with RTE, you'd be paying a license fee to RTE. But I know we don't watch anything like RTE. I mean, we stream anything, probably shouldn't be giving this away, but anything I watch in terms of media is usually streamed or found on the internet live. So TV is not if the Kemen took the TV away tomorrow, we wouldn't miss it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even among, say, my peer group, when I was growing up and in school, everybody had a television. If you watched anything, it was on TV. And maybe you would come across one or two people every decade who didn't have a television, and that was weird. Now so many people just simply don't have televisions, because not because they're not looking to consume media, but quite simply because they don't need one anymore. And this is clearly something that the state are cottoning on to.
Absolutely. They're keeping up with the times, as they say.
Yeah.
So that is on its way. I mean, look, it may not happen tomorrow morning, it may not happen the next day, but people now, and it lends its way forward into the next question they have: if you have access to the internet.
Yeah, of course.
Read it out verbatim just for the sake of reading it out. Question H11: does your household have access to the internet? Well, I think irrespective of whether or not you say yes, no, maybe, or don't answer the question at all, eventually there'll be, as we suggested here, this tax, we'll call it, the broadcasting tax or charge, they will no longer seek that you go out and get a license for it ultimately, because we're in the age of modern technology, so on and so forth. What they'll be doing is they'll actually levy it upon perhaps something, and Pete Rabbit said this himself, that they will consider bringing it on as part of a service charge, an additional service charge for, say, your electricity.
Yeah.
You have the capability. It's like I have the capability of watching television. That's really what they're trying to charge you with. I have the capability of watching a television. It's not really that relevant to them if you have or haven't got television, but you have the capability of receiving signals into your home. So that's where they're coming from. If you have the capability of receiving signals. So everybody in this country, irrespective of whether or not you're actually on the internet, you have the capability of receiving internet.
Yeah.
Because you'll either have a handheld device or just alone. If you have nothing in your house, you still have the capability of receiving an internet signal. So I'd imagine the way they'll get this past the post is by looking at something like gas, electricity or water charges and levy a fee on top of that.
Or even the providers of the internet service. So if you turn around and, for example, decide that, right, it's going to be an extra £100 a year and you're going to charge for each connection provided by whatever provider it might be, say Air or Vodafone, whoever, an extra £100 or £150 a year, but you're allowed to pass that on to the customer. It's up to you. We're not telling you what to do, and we're not taxing the people, the public per se, so there's no media field day about this. But all of a sudden everybody's bill rises by 100 and 150 quid, and the provider is just collecting that tax on behalf of the state.
Well, isn't that what they've done with insurance policies?
Exactly.
Insurance policies, if you go and book a flight, there's a charge, a government charge. There's a government charge and everything.
Yeah.
You know, and they see this as the way forward in case people like us turn around and say, well, no, I'm not paying a licence fee. Now, I'm not saying that you or I wouldn't pay a licence fee if it's appropriate, but it will reduce the amount of people that will have the option not to pay.
Yeah.
And they don't want that. They want they want everybody to pay. And then for those who actually do not manage to avoid, we won't say evade, but avoid the payment of it, they'll classify them as spongers.
Yeah.
As they do. You know, so you can't win.
No, you can't, but you can at least fight the battle.
Yeah.
We're coming up on close to the end of the... I mean, there are many more bits and pieces contained within the census, but I think at this stage, we've been talking about it for the bones of an hour. People will, broadly speaking, get where we're coming from with regard to why these questions are being asked, and people can use their own heads and discern for themselves.
Question 12. Yeah, it is question H12, and it's actually on the document, but what it says is go to next page. There isn't actually per se on the face of it a question H12.
Yeah, that's what confused me, because there's no question mark.
What it does say, just to confirm there, Lionel is looking at this right now, it says H12, go to the next page, yeah? So we take it that question H12 is in the statement they have, all persons must be enumerated where they spend census night. Now, I don't know how we want to approach this. Do you want to just read this out verbatim of what we have?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's probably the easiest way of doing it. We know this might seem quite an anomalous thing to discuss, but bear with us for a moment. One of the statements contained on the next page is as follows. Present persons include in list 1 all persons alive at midnight on Sunday 24th of April who spend the night at this address. That's a quote. Now, if the term or word person or persons is defined by law as quote-unquote a legal fiction, then how could or can a legal fiction, that is a person, be alive? Like, surely to God, all persons by their legal definition are not alive.
They're dead.
Yeah, they're dead. So do the state want or wish to trick you into giving false evidence by making false statements? Is that what they're at here?
Well, this is what we talked about a little bit earlier, and this is why I would feel, if I was seriously thinking about filling in a census form, I'm not saying I am or I'm not, but if I was critically looking at this, I'd be thinking, right, the legal definition of the term, in legal terms...
And we're not just being pedantic here. I mean, sorry to interject, but this has to be pointed out. We are dealing in legalities here, so you've got to use the correct terminology, and you've got to reference it correctly.
They've said, and they consistently use the term person, and they forward this question or this next set of questions with the term and the use of the word person, which in law is defined as a legal fiction or entity. Yeah. So it is determined that, and we've covered podcasts and broadcasts on this before in terms of what a persona or a person is, and it comes from Latin / Greek, and it means something that is not alive. It's not sentient, it's not conscious. Yeah. It's like a corporation. That's probably what it's referred to. It's referred to as being a corporation, a legal entity. And is completely separate from a man or woman. It's a dead thing. Yeah. It's a fiction. It's like anything that's a fiction, it's not alive. But they want you then to put yourself into the mindset of, right, a person. Right. So they want you to tell them all the persons that are alive. Now, I don't know how you can do that. If a person is dead, how can you declare that they're alive?
You can't unless you're telling a lie.
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
And lie is contained in the word alive, by the way. So, right, are not all persons by their legal definition not alive?
Well, they are by their legal definition, they are not alive.
Yeah. Okay. Do the state want or wish to trick you into giving false evidence by making false statements in the declaration?
Well, based on the information that we have, if we critically analyse it, that's exactly what they're trying to do.
Okay. Do you want to read this? Because I think your voice for reading this stuff is probably a bit more clearer than mine.
Okay, well, further it goes on to state, persons who stayed temporarily in the household, that is visitors, and persons who arrived the following morning not having been enumerated elsewhere. Okay, well, that's definitely worth watching out for on the night of the 24th of April. The living dead just visiting, and the living dead arrived on the following morning. So will the living dead be able to tell us that they are not, that they're just staying temporarily, passing through, so to speak, with the pun fully intended? And will the living dead be able to tell us that they have not been enumerated elsewhere? And this might sound ridiculous to the listeners, but we're breaking it down and critically analysing the words that they have used. So, do the living dead have households or accommodation? Do the living dead know when their households or accommodation were built? Do the living dead have mortgages, rent, lease, have council housing, or live entirely rent and mortgage free? Spongers. If the living dead do rent, how much rent do they pay? And whom do they pay it to? Do the living dead have special living dead landlords? How many rooms do the living dead need, use, or sleep in? Do they sleep? Do they sleep standing up, or do the living dead need to lie down? Do the living dead need central heating or heat of any kind, or are they okay using other as indicated on the census form? You would hardly think the living dead would have much use for a piped water supply, and surely their sanitation needs would be quite minimal, if any at all. Do the living dead know how to drive cars and vans? Is that how they get about nowadays? Do the living dead use the internet? Do they have PCs or laptops or mobile phones? If they do, can they not just feck off and fill in their own census forms online and leave the living people alone? And there's the distinction, people versus persons, the living dead versus the man or woman. I mean, this will make for a very interesting night and following morning indeed. Could we make a movie about this? Could we get some kind of zombie movie?
I think there is a few already.
Could we get John Carpenter, who did They Live, which we referenced earlier, to direct this movie? This isn't just nonsense. This paragraph is not nonsense. This is absolutely pertinent.
Yeah.
Because we haven't, I mean, fair enough, we're using the term living dead, but we're applying that in a critical sense to the terminology, the legal terminology that the state have framed this feckin' document with.
Absolutely, yep.
So it's not just absolute pie in the sky nonsense, and we're not just having a joke for the sake of having a joke here. This is critical analysis. So, I mean, we could go on some more about the rest of the 21 very odd pages in intimate, personal and private detail, but I don't think we need to do that. I think the 12 or so questions that we have handled there will give people a very good handle on what it is and the angle that we're trying to approach this census from, and they can make their own decisions based upon that. And I know we will probably get some stick for the whole living dead thing, but get beyond that. Listen to what we've actually said about what the living dead are and where it comes from, and apply it to the conversation that we've had for the last hour with that frame of reference. And I think you'll possibly come up with some answers by yourself and for yourself as to whether or not it's in your best interest to fill out this census form, in a collective sense or in a personal sense.
Well, again, the decision is down to the listener, the reader, what they want to do. And just to reiterate, I suppose, to give people a little bit of confidence, go back and listen to the beginning of this talk, this relatively short talk, and hear what we said about deciding whether or not you want to return the form. It's nobody's business really whether or not you have returned the form, but if you want to get over that hump of the enumerator calling to the door, my suggestion would be, whether or not you have or have not returned the form, is to say, well, as far as I'm concerned, the form was sent back in the post. And beyond that, I know nothing.
Exactly. I mean, if you don't know the answer to a question, how can you give a yay or a nay? And nobody can force you to. It's like if you're dragged into the police station, we've discussed it in our Gary Doyle Order Talks. why would you testify against yourself in the Garda station, on the side of the road, in court even for that matter? You don't have to say anything.
And just to close out, people, they have to use the term declaration where you sign. So declaration is another word for contract.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind. Is this a contract or agreement that you want to agree to? That's really what it boils down to. Now, in law, you cannot be forced to make a declaration or sign a contract or agreement against your will.
And even the word, and a bit of homework for people if they're interested in the etymology of words and why certain words are used. We hear a lot about proclamations at this time of the year and this particular year. Look up the difference between a proclamation and a declaration, what the words actually mean, where they come from, and you'll open up a whole new Pandora's box for yourself there. Well, I think we've pretty much covered certainly everything that I was planning on covering. What about you, Des? I mean, if people have any feedback or questions, of course, we have the feedback specials coming up very, very soon. Our next episode, indeed, will be the first of those feedback specials. We'll be getting through every single bit of feedback, and we've loads and loads to cover.
Yeah, there's one thing I'd just like to add, and over the last few weeks we've made an issue of it, I suppose, to a certain extent, and that people are listening to this. Hopefully we're getting more people listening all the time. But if you're listening, share it. Share the broadcast. Share the articles, because like we put a hell of a lot of work, and like we've worked around the clock to make sure we got the article done and to make sure we got this broadcast done above everything else, and that's what we're dedicated to doing. So we'd very much appreciate that people start spreading this information out, and specifically this article and this bit of the talk, or the CLS Talks, because it needs to get out to people before the 24th of April. We'll do our best. We're obviously doing our best here to get it done, get it edited and get it pushed out there along with the article and all the rest of it. So we want you guys to make an effort, a concerted effort, to get this spread. Get it, do whatever you need to do to get it viral. We're not engaged in any way with Facebook or with any of the other social media platforms. We're leaving that up to the listeners to say, well, look, this is an interesting perspective on the census, and it's information I think that everybody should have. So we don't beg anybody for anything, but we'd suggest very strongly that you spread this and share it. Have the debates, have the arguments, and by all means send us loads and loads and loads of feedback. We'll deal with all or any feedback we get.
Absolutely. And I've one question for the listeners as well. There's something that I've been meaning to ask. With the 1916 celebrations that are going on, why is everybody waving the tricolour around in celebration of the 1916 rising? That's my question. I'm just wondering. So Grant, we'll talk to you very, very soon with a feedback special. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Phil.
That morning,
The CLS Talks.